Rolling.
Rolling, rolling.
When did I first meet the ocean? I've been thinking back on this. I can't remember if I was 11 or 12, but it was somewhere around that age when I really felt like I actually met the ocean. I was growing up in Ontario, Canada, on the Great Lakes, which is like a big freshwater ocean, but it's decidedly not an ocean. There's no whales or nothing like that. And my family were going on a road trip out east. We had family out there around Boston or Groton, somewhere around Cape Cod, that area. And I said, if we're going on this road trip, if we're going to be driving 12 hours across the country, and remember, I'm 11 or something, that's a long amount of time to spend in a car with your sister in the backseat. But I said, if we're going to be doing this, we got to go to the Cape Cod and we got to go whale watching.
The story you are enjoying comes from Dr. Andy Szabo, a Canadian marine biologist and director of the Alaska Whale Foundation. Andy is likely the human I have asked the most questions to concerning marine mammals. For years, I have witnessed him educate and endear audiences to the culture and science of humpback whales. At the time this interview took place, Dr. Szabo and I had just finished an epic run observing humpback whales in the Southern Ocean. We were aboard the National Geographic Explorer journeying back to South America, so I wanted to get Andy on the microphone and give him a chance to share the important work being done in the opposite hemisphere by the Alaska Whale Foundation.
So we did. We drove to the coast and piled on a boat, went on a 3-hour tour out of Provincetown, I think, actually, on the tip of Cape Cod, and went out whale watching. And literally my first meeting of the ocean was also the first time I saw a whale, and it was a humpback whale. It was transformative, life-changing. It was incredible. 3 hours out to sea, humpback whales coming and rocking the boat and breaching beside the boat and thinking this is the most incredible experience I could ever imagine.
Don't humpback whales get their scientific name from that area?
They do. Megaptera nova angliae. Megaptera just means big wing, but nova angliae is New England. So yeah, the New England big wing is the humpback whale. So, and the thing about that was, and I didn't realize it at the time, if you go to the East Coast, humpback whales are really curious and they will approach boats readily. They'll come up there, they'll rub them, they'll rock them, they'll check them out. I kind of thought at that point, moving forward, that was the way humpbacks were, that's the way whales were. But it turns out that's not the case. Where I am now in Southeast Alaska, where I work, and down here in Antarctica, that just doesn't happen. Whales don't approach boats. So it was a pretty remarkable encounter with those critters out there.
My name is Paul North, your host and director of Meet the Ocean. And our mission is to collect the stories and perspectives of those who spend their lives interacting with salt water. The goal is to obtain the broadest view of how we live on this planet, in order to show how much we as humans benefit from and rely upon a healthy ocean. Listen along with us, and I promise you will learn.
Meet the ocean.
Ultimately, the sort of nascent biologist was born probably in my grandparents' house, watching birds out the back window. They had bird feeder in their yard, and they got all these great little migrants coming through, and they had a bird book, and they had binoculars there, and we would sit there and check off all the species that arrived at their bird feeder, and I just kind of really enjoyed that. And that kind of led me to pursuing biology. I just kind of always knew I wanted to do something like that. I wanted to be outdoors, I wanted to study animals, and I went to university and I got a general degree at the University of Victoria, ultimately, in biology. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to take a field course during the summer months at a field station called the Bamfield Marine Science Center. And that's a field station run by 5 different West Coast universities in Canada. And it's on this little town of about 250 people on Vancouver Island, out in the middle of nowhere, basically. You have to drive 4 hours of logging roads to get there. No airport, nothing, really no boat traffic or anything like that. And I got out to this remote field station, and I was, surrounded by like-minded students who are all at the last stages of their undergraduate career. And you find friends in university, and you find people that are interested in the same things you are, but going to this sort of immersive field station, all of a sudden I was surrounded by people that really, truly wanted to be in that place and were very open to the experience of being in that place. And so we spent 3 months basically going out every day and immersing ourselves in the field, then coming back and having an hour or two of lecture with the professors. We're living with the professors, we're living with the students, we're in this remote field station. It was transformative. It was a really big moment. The second thing about being there was a biologist who was actually conducting some experiments for the last part of his PhD thesis. His name was Fred Sharp, now Dr. Fred Sharp, who's now a colleague of mine and a good friend. He was out there, and I just bumped into him one night. I was down at the dock. It was 11 o'clock at night. I was hanging out at the dock watching these schooling fish at the dock there, and he comes down out of the woods, basically, and if you ever meet Fred Sharp, that will make a lot more sense. He seems to live in the woods. But anyway, he comes out of the woods with this big underwater speaker, walks past me, throws it in the water, and starts blasting these humpback whale sounds to these sardines, these pilchards that are schooling right at the dock there. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm studying humpback whales in Alaska. This is a feeding call they make. I want to see if sardines respond to it the same way that herring do in Alaska." And so we got to talking, and after a few days of him being around this station, he invited me to come up to Alaska. That was 1999. I flew up the next summer to volunteer for 2 weeks with the Alaska Whale Foundation, which was an organization he had started 5 years earlier. Got on a boat with him, motored out of this little tiny First Nations village called Angoon. Within 10 minutes, we were surrounded by bubble netting humpback whales. And I remember just thinking, this is the most insane thing I can imagine. There was whales everywhere, they're bubble netting. It was another one of these transformative experiences. I say this a lot, but it was. And it's another one of these experiences that at the time I thought, oh my God, if this is the way it goes every day here, this is incredible. Just like when I was on the East Coast thinking this is the way humpback whales are, when in reality it was that place at that time. It, to some extent, was that way with Alaska when I arrived there, but at the same time, I was looking around. There was probably 4 or 5 other people on the boat at the time. I was looking around at them, and they were not getting as excited. They were just kind of, oh yeah, there they are, writing stuff down, but going back to chatting between dives with the whales were diving. And I remember thinking, this is crazy. This behavior is going on here. There's these whales all over the place. These people aren't even getting all that excited about it, and I realized it's because they had been there for a month working with these whales. This was what was going on that summer in that place, and so I realized around about the same time that I had to come up there in subsequent years and kick off a project, and Fred invited me up, and I'm still there.
Hi, my name is Michelle Fournay. I'm a research associate with Alaska Whale Foundation. I am an acoustic ecologist by training and have been working with AWF since 2011 was when I first joined the organization.
Don't be surprised if Michelle's voice sounds familiar. She is an official member of the Meet the Ocean team and dropped knowledge about the vocalizations of Weddell seals in episode 4 of our podcast. Having worked side by side with Dr. Szabo for years, she has proven an integral part of the Alaska Whale Foundation team and provided some truly dynamic insight into the world these whales live in.
If you imagine yourself outside in a natural space and you close your eyes and you listen to how the world interacts around you, that's acoustic ecology. It's how living things interact with each other and with the environment, and how those interactions are mediated with sound. So how sound influences the world and the creatures that live in it. So what we are doing right now is acoustic ecology. I'm talking and you're listening, we're communicating. So when a bird calls and another bird responds, that's also acoustic ecology. But when a crab navigates around a reef because it's listening to the pops that the coral's making, and it's using that to find its way back to its habitat, that's also acoustic ecology. Acoustics is just the study of sound, and ecology is the study of the interactions of life in the natural world.
That is absolutely fascinating. What brought you to that specific journey?
Well, a job. Not because there's a lot of jobs in acoustic ecology, but because I needed a job. I was living in Chicago, and I was broke and poor and cold. And I got on the internet and I said, I'm going to take absolutely the first job that I can find. And the first job that I could find was working on a whale watching boat in Juneau, Alaska. And so I packed up my dog and we moved to Alaska, and I started working on boats and watching humpback whales. And when you spend that much time, day in, day out, interacting with the ocean, it changes something in you. And at first, it inspired me because I'd never seen a whale before. I had been landlocked. And then it excited me because I got to teach other people about the ocean and teach them about whales. And then this deep sense of guilt started nagging at me because I spent 8 hours a day, 6 days a week on boats watching whales. And those boats make a lot of noise. And my conscience asked me whether or not what I was doing on the water was worth it, and whether or not these animals were being negatively impacted by this particular behavior. And when I started looking into it, the answer was that we didn't know. We know that humpback whales and marine mammals can detect sounds. We know that to a degree they appear to be responding to them, but that was kind of it. And so I fell into acoustic ecology because my conscience put me there. It said there is a question about the ocean that someone should answer. And for as much as these animals had given me, it felt like at some point in time I needed to turn around and give something back. So I began the study of bioacoustics. And more specifically, I look at the impact of anthropogenic noise, vessel noise, on humpback whales and marine mammals.
Anthropogenic noise, or man noise, human noise.
Exactly.
Alaska, probably one of the most ideal places to study marine mammals, I would guess.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There are very few places where you can wake up in the morning and have a cup of coffee with a harbor seal. And Juneau, Alaska is one of those. Not only that, you go and you can walk out your front door, walk out to the beach, and there will be 2 humpback whales hanging out, and a bear walking down the beach, and a harbor seal popping its head up, and some Dall's porpoise swimming around. It is a mecca for marine mammals. So it's a really spectacular place to do the kind of work that I do. And I feel really lucky that I kind of fell into it. I didn't think that Alaska was on my radar. So when I ended up there for 7 years, I lived year-round in Juneau. And at some point you wake up with your cup of tea and you're sitting on the beach and you're looking at the whales and you're thinking, how did this happen? And that's your life, and that's what you get to do. So people often ask me, how do you study marine mammals? How do you make that happen? And my response is always, you move there. You figure out where the animals are and you set up shop. And then you sit on the beach and you study them. And eventually, if you do that long enough, somebody's going to start to take you seriously.
AWF was founded in 1996, and it was founded by my colleague Fred Sharp in large part to support his graduate school research on humpback whales, which he was doing at the time. It was a nonprofit that allowed him to accept small donations, which at the time was sufficient to put fuel in our small little boat and put food on the table over in the field, and really that was all that was needed for his research. Over the years, we have been developing the organization and expanding it so that we take on more graduate students now. We maintain an active research program pretty much every summer we're up there. We'll have 2 different projects going on this year with different grad students from various universities. And we also do a lot of educational work. We do a lot of outreach while we're up there, meeting with vessels that are in the area, with general public that are cruising through the area or that come to visit our field station that we have in Southeast Alaska. And we have a conservation program. We work with the Coast Guard and the National Marine Fisheries Service as part of a network of responders. And basically, marine mammals get entangled in fishing gear up in Alaska. It's a problem. Happens there as elsewhere. When that happens, we work with the Coast Guard to get out there and respond to those incidences and disentangle the animals. So we have these various types of programs, but at the foundation of all of that are undergraduate interns and volunteers, and in some cases graduate volunteers as well. So every summer we invite anywhere from 4 to 8, in some cases 12, volunteers to come up and to work with us in the field. We put them up, we host them at our field station, we get them out to the field, and in many ways they are the ones actually out there collecting the data and doing the work, and it's incredible for them. I mean, the unfortunate reality of my own personal position is the more I become a director of the organization, the less I actually spend out on the water, but it's these volunteers that are out there collecting the photo identification data of the whales, doing behavioral observations, getting skin samples and scat samples and dragging plankton nets and all that. So again, every year we usually put out a call in January broadly across a number of different forums, and just people can apply, and we go through a process of selecting anywhere from 4 to 12 depending on what programs we're running in any given year, get them on up there, and there we go. It's now the end of March. I will be arriving in Alaska in a few days. I'll be going straight over to our field station, and within 4 weeks we'll have our first round of volunteers coming up. It's pretty exciting.
That is exciting. And for anyone who is interested in volunteering, go straight to AWF's website to find out more. You honestly can't go wrong with humpbacks. They are all over our planet. But the reason people go to Alaska specifically is to see them take part in a phenomenon of great cooperation and communication. And if you haven't heard of it, it's called bubble netting.
It's notable among marine mammals, or I should say in general among baleen whales, that they tend not to be cooperative foraging animals. And the reason is most of what they're foraging on, krill, or to a lesser degree schooling fish, don't really require a great degree of cooperation to either herd, to capture, to locate, or anything like that. So most baleen whales tend to be solitary. Any sort of associations that they form with each other are fairly ephemeral. Yet in Southeast Alaska, we have this small group of individual whales that have taken this degree of cooperation and sociality to a whole new level among baleen whales, and as best as we can tell, among animals in general. And the reason I say that is what we find is these groups of whales, up to 24 whales at a time, we've seen groups of 24 forming to do this cooperative bubble net foraging. We get these groups of whales that work together to herd herring, to corral herring, and they do that by blowing a ring of bubbles, this large ring of bubbles that's 30, 40 meters across in diameter. One whale blows this bubble ring. Basically, they're swimming in a circle and emitting air from their blowhole, and as that rises to the surface, it creates this effervescent curtain that persists in the water column for a few minutes. While they're doing this, while that one individual is doing this, the remaining whales in this group swim down below the herring and start driving the herring up into this pre-existing bubble net that's been laid out by this individual whale, which incidentally, this bubble net is a tool. I mean, this is maybe surprising to a lot of people, but humpback whales are tool users. I mean, that is a tool. It's external from the body, used to manipulate the environment. That's a tool. It's not a stick or a bat or a screwdriver, but it is indeed a tool. And one individual, one whale, is using that tool for the benefit of the group, so it's a communal tool. Highly unusual in the animal kingdom, but these whales are doing it. Anyway, they've got this bubble net deployed, basically like a big seine net, like you see with the fishermen up in Alaska. The remaining whales drive the fish into that net. One of those whales that's driving it into the net starts basically screaming at the herring, emitting this very loud feeding call, and that just causes those fish to flee, and the only direction they can go is up because there's a wall of whales pushing them to the surface, and they go right into that net, and the whales chase them up, and at the last minute they all break the surface mouths open and take in all the herring. So it's this very coordinated and complex behavior. I mean, they're working in a three-dimensional environment. There must be some degree of communication between the individuals because they need to know what their roles are. Those roles, incidentally, the bubble blower, the vocalizer, those seem to be roles that are consistent among individuals. They adopt specific roles. They're specializing in specific tasks. So there has to be some way that these animals are coordinating this behavior. But anyway, it's this very complex behavior. It's very remarkable. Bubble netting behavior was the basis of my colleague Fred Sharp's PhD work. And so he spent 8 years, basically before I even got there, to Alaska studying that behavior. And we've learned much about the social structure of those individuals. They have these enduring bonds that'll persist for multiple decades, some of the whales that do this. They're not related to one another. That's pretty remarkable as well, to have cooperation to that degree among unrelated individuals. When you look at other terrestrial mammals, such as wolves or anything like that, they tend to be in family groups, because if you're going to cooperate, it pays to do it with your family. You all share the same genes and so forth. But with these whales, that's not the case. They're a bit of an enigma, both among whales certainly, but among animals in general. I always say when I do talks that if you look at this suite of attributes, enduring social bonds between unrelated individuals that'll persist for multiple decades, task specialization among those individuals, divvying up the work, among the group, and tool users, especially communal tool users. When you look for animals that exhibit that suite of attributes, you basically keep looking until you come to humans, because there's really nothing else that we know of that does that. Humpback whales and humans. Pretty remarkable for a group of animals that we used to consider were basically cows out there mowing the lawn, eating krill. Now, that's clearly not the case.
We've been talking about how humpback whales communicate. We've investigated a little bit about bubble net feeding, and we know that they sing songs, but that's only part of their range of vocalizations, and you seem to have some insight into that.
I do. So humpback whale song is really sexy. Everybody wants to talk about it because that was what we first learned. We said, oh, humpbacks sing. That's amazing. And we made records about it, and we made it the most important thing that whales do. But they do a lot more than just sing. They grumble, and they swap, and they purr, and they coo, and they make a whole manner of very rude sounds and a whole manner of very romantic sounds. And all of these are called non-song vocalizations, which is not a very romantic way of putting it. We also call them social sounds, which is maybe not as scientifically accurate because we don't know if they're social. We don't know what they're for, but we do call them social sounds. And humpback whales everywhere, all over the world, produce these sounds. So baby whales make social sounds. Old whales make social sounds. Lady whales make social sounds. And so it seems only fair that we should put some time and effort into studying the sounds that all of the whales are producing instead of just these breeding calls that only males are producing. And so in Southeast Alaska, we have focused an enormous amount of effort into understanding what sounds they're producing, which until 2015 we didn't know. And now we're working more closely on figuring out what those sounds mean. And then the last sort of stage in the story is to figure out how resilient are they to the changing ocean? Can they continue to use these sounds if we are making a bunch of noise?
Excuse me.
I think it would be beneficial to describe how a hydrophone works. People don't really wrap their head around that.
Yeah, a hydrophone is just an underwater microphone. It's very, very simple. So there's a couple ways you could do it, but if you think of someone on stage and they're singing into a microphone, they hold it in their hand. Well, wrap that in rubber and drop it in the ocean and you have a hydrophone. That's exactly what it is. And you just attach it to a recorder. In fact, I use the exact brand of recorder that we're recording this podcast with. I just put mine in a plastic bag and bring it out onto a boat. Then there are also more sophisticated hydrophones. So I do some work with a much larger hydrophone system where I have 4 hydrophones and they weigh 700 pounds each. And I sink them to the bottom of the ocean and I leave them there for 6 months. And then I turn around and bring them back. And by having 4 hydrophones that are all listening simultaneously, I can actually go back and localize sound. So remember how I told you sound was energy, which means that it has velocity, it has speed. So if I am sitting closer to someone and I say something, they will hear it first. If there's someone sitting behind them, they will hear it second. Well, if I have 4 hydrophones under the water, when my whale vocalizes, it will hit the first hydrophone first, then the second, then the third, and then the fourth. If I have my timing all lined up just right, and I know exactly where my hydrophones are, it means that I can retroactively do some fancy physics and I can say, oh, this is exactly where my whale was when it vocalized. So that's sort of the range from complicated to simple. You can put very large instruments with very highly precise clocks that will tell you where your animal is, how deep it is, how loud the animal was vocalizing, at exactly what time. Or you can sit in a kayak. You can make a hydrophone. There's instructions online. You can go to YouTube and go to, build your own hydrophone. And they'll teach you about putting like a tiny crystal and a speaker in some sand in a balloon and drop it over the side of a kayak. And you can listen to the ocean that way too. So it doesn't have to be complicated, but it can be.
Doesn't it feel somewhat strange to be talking about something we can't see? If you think about it, we can only describe sound after we have experienced it, after the little hairs in our ears pick up all those vibrations. But those vibrations work differently depending on which molecules they are traveling through. And if you want to learn how that all works, all you have to do is point a microphone at an acoustic ecologist and press record.
Sound travels approximately 5 times faster under the water than it does in air. And this has to do with the density of water. So Probably the best way to explain this is imagine that you're holding onto a metal pipe. If somebody clangs the end of it, that vibration is going to move its way down the pipe and you're going to feel it in your hands really fast. If you, on the other side of the room from me, swipe the air, I'm not going to feel it over here. Now, that vibration is still going to perpetuate through the air, and eventually it will come to me, possibly in the form of wind, but that vibration isn't going to move as quickly. So underwater, if you were to clap your hands, I'm going to get that wave, right? It's going to hit me. And then again, metal pipe, it'll come to me really fast. So density changes how energy moves. So when you have denser substances like water, energy will move through it faster. Sound is energy. So when you think about the water, when I produce a sound underwater, it is going to travel through that dense medium and it will go much faster, which means it's also going to go much further. So producing a sound in air, it's going to eventually sort of fall flat. Whereas producing a sound in water, it will go approximately 5 times farther before it also falls flat. Which is why most animals have evolved to use sound when they communicate in the ocean.
We can't even hear some of the lower tones that they're
Oh,
making.
no, absolutely not. But you can feel them. If you were to dive in the water with a blue whale, you probably can't hear the vocalizations that they're making because they're so low frequency. Our bodies are actually too small to absorb the wavelength of a blue whale vocalization in such a way that we can then process that as sound. But that vibration is still going to hit you. So it's possible that you would get a deep rumbling in your belly. You would feel the sound instead of actually hearing it. And if you were to record it and speed it up, then of course you could listen to it. But when you're underwater, it would be something you would have to sense in a different way.
I have heard from others that you don't want to be scuba diving with sperm whales just in case you get hit by some of their sound.
Right? Yeah. A sperm whale echolocation clicks are so powerful that possibly it's just a rumor, but they say that it could actually knock you out if you were close enough to an echolocating sperm whale. Just bam, give you a moment. Now, I haven't confirmed that. I should look it up as a scientist, but still, what a cool thought that you could get knocked out by sound.
That is a cool thought. Hopefully, though, I'll never have to put that theory to the test. But if you want to talk about cool, a few weeks before beginning this episode, Dr. Szabo sent over some audio of a sperm whale traveling through the waters of Southeast Alaska. And it wasn't alone. Imagine one large loner of a male sperm whale, the very beast that Melville personified, coming across a pod of Orcinus orca, better known as killer whales. This is the recording of that encounter. The sharp, repetitive clicks are the echolocations of the sperm whale. And that whining call comes from one or perhaps multiple killer whales. 2 of the most legendary ocean predators, the largest of their kind, crossing paths. What was being communicated? Can they even understand what the other is saying? These are the questions that the Alaska Whale Foundation strives to answer. But I think we need to go back to bubble net feeding. Why? I don't know, maybe because these whales are essentially fitting swimming pools inside of their mouths. To understand these creatures, you absolutely must comprehend how it is they feed.
We don't have good, accurate estimates from in the field of how much water a whale takes into its mouth, prey-laden water a whale takes into its mouth whenever it makes a lunge. But you know a few things. First of all, if you look at a humpback whale, or any of the whales that we call rorquals, blue whales, fin whales, humpback whales, sei whales, minke whales, they have these ventral throat pleats that makes their throat like an accordion. And that means when they take in water, that thing expands like a big balloon and into huge proportions. We estimate, based upon animals that have beached themselves, that have basically filled with gas, and that pouch has been expanded while the animal was dead, and people have taken measurements of the size of that and estimated the volume from those measurements, which may have some error associated with them. We've come up with my colleagues have come up with an estimate of about 16,000 gallons, 57 cubic meters of space, of water they can potentially take in their mouth in one lunge. But all of that is in this big throat cavity. They're not swallowing that. And incidentally, the size of their throat is about the size of a cantaloupe, which is much smaller than I think most people would expect. You know, we think about that as biologists. If we ever got trapped in that mouth, we're not going down the throat. They're going to have to spit us out, which is a good thing, as long as you can hold your breath. So these animals are taking in all this water that's full of prey, but they got to get rid of the water. They can't take bellies full of salt water every time they take a big scoop, so somehow they have to strain that water out. And the way they do that is they have baleen. That's why they're called baleen whales. And baleens are basically this keratin, like fingernail structure, that extends down from the upper jaw and the mouths, and it creates basically a comb. And the animals are able to force the water back out using their tongue. They'll use that tongue to force the water back out of that pouch, back out of their mouth, across that baleen, which is on the outer fringe of the mouth. All the water squirted out, and all the prey, the krill, the herring, whatever it else is trapped in their mouths. So they're basically evacuating all the water. I'm sure they get some water, but they're evacuating it, and then they're swallowing the prey. We don't have a very good estimate of how much food they get per lunge, per mouthful, but estimates on the energetics of what is required to be a whale on a day-to-day basis, when you also factor in that they have to store some blubber for a 4-month fast during the winter months when they're breeding, estimates are maybe 500 pounds a day. And that's a very conveniently round number, but it seems to be about 500 pounds a day is what these whales need. So, you know, you can imagine them taking 100 lunges in a day. You divide that, and I'm sure you could come up with some number. But again, that's one of the big million-dollar questions: is how much are these individuals taking per mouthful? One of the interesting things we're considering doing this summer, we've been approached by a number of people using drones. Drone technology has gotten to a point where you have very high-resolution cameras on very stable drones, very stable platforms. If you can fly those over top of those bubble netting whales and start getting images, you can count the fish at the surface just before the whales actually take a mouthful. In theory, you do that enough times, you can count how many herring are going into the mouth of a whale on every single lunge. You do that across the summer, at different times of the year, and you can start getting an idea about the energetics associated with bubble netting, how successful a strategy it is, and just more generally how much these whales need to feed on, which is good when we start thinking about what the capacity of the environment to support these growing populations of whales. It's very important to somehow get those numbers dialed down, and that might be a really novel and intriguing way to do it.
The Alaska Whale Foundation has partnered with the Juneau Lighthouse Association to establish sort of a secondary and much smaller remote field site. So Andy, our director, Dr. Zabo, has done such a nice job of really putting together this research and education center in Baranof Warm Springs. And as a spin-off of that, we go to some of the sort of adjacent areas to do research there as well. So when I joined the Alaska Whale Foundation with Andy as my master's advisor, I worked from the 18.3 meter tower of the Five Finger Lighthouse. And the Five Finger Lighthouse was both the first and last manned lighthouse in Alaska. And if you go into the lighthouse, it's on a tiny, tiny island. It's 3 acres at low tide and 2.25 acres at high tide. If you go into the lighthouse, there you can see written on the walls the names of the coasties, the Coast Guard crew that was stationed there, and they would write these long notes on the walls, like, please call our wives. And with Alaska Whale Foundation as a platform, I ran a research station there for 2 summers looking at humpback whale non-song vocalizations, recording these social sounds. So we'd take a very, very small boat, an almost embarrassingly small boat, and sometimes kayaks, and we would go and drift around the waters of Frederick Sound with a microphone in the water. And at the time, I felt like, are we doing this right? I was very young and very naive, and I didn't know what legacy I was walking into. Now I've been doing this much longer, and I'm looking at some of the historic data that was collected in that same area at the Five Finger Lighthouse. Roger Payne, who first collected whale song, made the LP. Well, he also sat in a tiny, tiny boat and drifted around near the Five Finger Lighthouse with a dip hydrophone and recorded some sounds. So, as it turns out, that is a very effective way to do it.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Fisher, and this is Creature Feature. Whales are quite truly one of my favorite varieties of animals, which isn't particularly impressive because about all marine creatures are on that list. Nonetheless, I find it pretty unfortunate to ponder the fact that they probably wouldn't have been if I had been alive less than a century ago. Chances are you already know this, but whales were once hunted to near extinction. Since the whaling industry reached its height around the 1850s in America, many whale populations have been decimated. For example, the North Atlantic right whale, whose numbers may be as few as 500, were particularly easy to hunt and provided very large amounts of oil. As such, they nearly became extinct during the whaling boom. Additionally, whales were often disregarded and villainized in popular culture, literature, and by businesses, while whaling captains were celebrated and honored. So, what exactly changed? In the year 1935, an environmentalist and biologist named Roger Payne was born in New York City. Later in life, he would become the publisher of the best-selling nature album of all time, the founder and president of Ocean Alliance, and quite possibly the savior of countless whales. After graduating Harvard and earning a PhD at Cornell, Payne studied the echolocative power of bats. In 1967, however, he began studying the behavior of whales and was the first man to, along with Scott McVeigh, discover that humpback whales sing songs. He also theorized that the songs of blue whales and fin whales were able to travel all the way across oceans, a theory later proved correct. But what Roger Payne will likely be remembered best and most prominently for is his 1970 release of the album Songs of the Humpback Whale, a recording of the ambient and exuberant mating calls of male humpbacks. Through his efforts, Payne helped determine that each whale song was about 6 to 30 minutes in length, and that the songs of whales are all the same, with slight differences in songs each year. He also discovered that whales were able to use key structures repeating at different intervals and an equivalent of rhyming. But why was this so important? Surprisingly, the album sold over 100,000 copies within a very limited time, providing it with multi-platinum status and making it the best-selling nature album to date. But at the time of Songs of the Humpback Whale's release, commercial whaling was still legal in a vast majority of countries, including the USA. When the mass public was exposed to the beautiful and intricate songs, they began to truly care about the well-being of the whales and learned that they were sentient and important beings. As such, in part, this album led to the massive steam that Ocean Alliance, the organization Roger Payne founded, received. And because of Ocean Alliance, as well as other allies of the sea, commercial whaling is now illegal all over the world as a result of the 1986 IWC ban. However, work is not done. In Norway, the whaling ban was only followed until the year 1993. Using a loophole, Norway allows its whalers to kill 1,000 minke whales, including breeding females. This can lead to the destruction of the entire species. In Japan, the government used scientific research as a front for the killing of and subsequent selling of whales for food. In Iceland, similar scientific research was done, and commercial whaling was officially reestablished in 2006. Every year, these three countries kill about 1,500 whales between them, even though there is very little demand for the meat of whales. But you can help. By making donations to the International Fund for Animal Welfare, the WDC, and other conservation efforts, you can help to save these beautiful, intelligent, and powerful creatures from painful, torturous, and unnecessary deaths. Thank you.
So Andy and I, we executed this pretty large-scale acoustic ecology project looking into social sounds of humpback whales near Five Finger. And that work we are picking back up again this summer. So this summer, the Alaska Whale Foundation and I will be looking at humpback whale non-song vocalizations by doing playbacks. So we're going to take a speaker from a slightly larger boat and put it under the water and play back some of these social sounds to see whether or not we get an acoustic response. So I'm going to drop a speaker under the water and say, hello, 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 hello. And hopefully the whale's going to go, hi. And I'm going to say, oh, got it, contact call, moving on. And then we'll try a different one and play all these different sounds and see how they respond or if they respond to us. And so in addition to doing these playbacks, fingers crossed, one of the things that we're going to try and do is put suction cup video tags on these whales so that not only am I going to play a sound back to a whale, I'm going to play a sound back to a whale, and then I'm going to know what it was doing when I played that sound back, and I'm going to know how it responds in water. So is it foraging? Did it stop foraging? Does it dive? Does it surface? Does it respond? Does it leave? And that will help me get some sort of idea as to what these vocalizations are for. It's not easy to have a research platform that gives you liberty to ask behavioral questions. It's rare. And so many people, I want to be a behavioral ecologist. I want to grow up and study the behavior of whales. And as somebody who gets to do that, I am not naive to my good graces. And that's one of, I think, the most powerful things about the Alaska Whale Foundation is that it's a platform for creative science. And as a nonprofit, it means that we have control over the questions we ask. And it is the questions that the people who make donations to us, the people who partner with us, that they can understand the value that enables us to ask these questions. So it's much harder if you're trying to write a federal grant or work with a big institution to get at some of these more subtle questions about behavior. And so again, that really is one of the greatest gifts that working at an institution this size with the community that we work in has given to us, is the ability to ask interesting questions and the independence and freedom to answer them.
There are opportunities for the general public, citizen scientists, as we call them, to participate in research and to assist researchers who are looking at various questions tied to marine mammals, notably whales, dolphins, and porpoises. When people are out on the water, they often have cameras. Everybody has a camera nowadays. Everybody's got an iPhone or something like that. When people are out there photographing these whales, there are now sites you can go with your photo and contribute your photo to one of these photo identification catalogs. For example, I believe down in the Southern Ocean here, there's one called Happy Whale, I think it was. But basically, they're looking for anybody who's photographed a whale down here to take that photo image and forward it, email it to this group. I think they're on the west coast of the US, and that will contribute to this growing catalog of shots, of images. And this is remarkable because there's so many people out there that a lot can be accomplished with relatively little funds and in relatively little amount of time. There's no way you could send an individual biologist out there and say, all right, we need 20,000 photo identification shots of humpbacks around the Antarctic Peninsula. It would just break the bank, nobody would fund it, it would never happen. But as long as there's people going to those places with cameras, then you can do that. Another thing that we're working on in Southeast Alaska, Alaska Whale Foundation, in collaboration with Redlands University and Oregon State University, is a citizen science-based project based upon an application called Whale Map. This is an Android-based application that basically allows individual volunteers, citizen scientists who are out there on the water, be it on a National Geographic vessel or on a private boat, whatever it is, whenever they encounter any marine mammal, be it a humpback whale, a sea otter, whatever it is, all they need to do is pull out their Android, which has been running, presumably in the background. This app basically records their path whenever they're moving. And whenever they see a marine mammal, they just tap on their screen there, a little drop-down window comes up, says, what do you see? You say humpback whale, a couple other things about the weather, tap that, click send, and if you're in cell phone reception, it'll forward that onto our database. If not, it'll store it until you do pass through somewhere with cell phone reception. But as a result, you get 200, 300, 400 people out there in Southeast Alaska cruising across the summer, all armed with this application. You get a really good estimate of the abundance and changing distribution patterns of all the different marine mammals that are out there simply by having these volunteers, and it's free for them and it's great for us going out there and collecting these data.
If this is your first time hearing about citizen science, then you're in for a treat. Because technology has come a long way. Far enough to allow the public to add to a growing scientific database. And data is a powerful thing, especially when we use it to better understand the experience of living on this planet. After this episode, you probably know more about whales now than you wanted to, but that just means that we are doing our job. And part of doing our job is bringing focus to the changes occurring on the planet we call home. If you think about it, when the phrase climate change comes up in conversation, people are talking about the air temperature rising. The only headline the oceans seem to get is predictions in sea level rise. But there is a whole lot more going on that we need to be talking about, because the ocean is complex, and we need to look closer and better understand what is happening below the surface, acoustically and otherwise.
The oceans, I mean, we all know the numbers at this point. 70% of the planet, the surface of the planet is covered by water. So clearly this is a blue planet. It's a water planet. But more than that, or at least tied to that, is the fact that the oceans basically drive the climate. The oceans and the circulation patterns, I mean, are huge in terms of driving productivity, distribution of heat and winds and all this that drive terrestrial patterns as well. And yet we still are only now just beginning to understand a lot of these processes that are going on in the ocean. Understanding processes tied to the distribution of productivity, where the phytoplankton are, and how organisms interact in the ocean. We can't see what's going on underwater for the most part. We're getting tools now that gives us new views and novel views into what's going on, but it's a very challenging environment to work. And you add to that, I mean, granted, we're a lot further ahead now than we were 50 years ago, certainly 100 years ago. I mean, we've explored most regions of the ocean to some extent, but not that much. But add to that, they're changing now, and they're changing fast. We talk about climate change and global warming as this looming threat that's occurring, and I think if we don't, we all should accept that that's true, and that's very much the case, and that we are in large part driving that, we as humans. What we often overlook, or seems to be overlooked, and it surprised me a little bit, is something else that's going on, and that's ocean acidification, which is basically, as we put more carbon dioxide into the environment, regardless of whether it's a greenhouse gas, regardless of what it's doing to the warming and the cooling of the planet, as we put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, more is absorbed into the ocean. That's a very simple chemical reaction. That's just the way it goes. And as carbon dioxide absorbs into the water, it creates carbonic acid. And as it does that, that's basically increasing the acidity of the water. And I certainly am not at the front lines of studying ocean acidification, but from talking with people who do look at this, they're now suggesting that where we estimate we're going to be in terms of the acidity of the ocean in 100 years is going to be extremely problematic for all those organisms at the bottom of the food chain. Krill, copepods, things that elaborate, crustaceans that elaborate these shells, calcium carbonate shells. They can't do that when the ocean acidity rises to the amounts that we're suggesting it's going to, the levels that we suggest it's going to in 100 years. And that could lead to a complete collapse of that very important bottom link in the food chain, which will just be transferred all the way up. I mean, we know that's what ultimately happens in these sort of interactions. And that's hugely problematic. And if anything, we have found that when we make predictions about warming and rates of melting of ice and rates of rising acidity levels, if anything, they seem to be happening faster than we predict. So when they say 100 years, maybe we should be thinking this is in 50 years. That is scary when you think 50 years, we're not even talking about anymore. You know, we always talk about, well, our grandchildren and their generation, they're the ones that are going to suffer. 50 years, it's entirely possible that we'll be sitting around, you and I, like, oh man, I can't believe it. We knew this was coming and it just happened. This is a near-term problem that could have huge global ramifications. And so I feel very strongly that people need to be thinking about this, and people's eyes need to be open to the problems that are occurring. And I have wrestled with this a little bit myself because I study whales. I study humpback whales, and I study humpback whale behavior. And the link between humpback whale behavior and whale conservation or marine conservation is somewhat, it's thin, it's a little bit tenuous. People would say, well, what is the value? Governments, when you're applying for grant money, this is always the best metric. They would say, well, tell me why you need to study bubble netting behavior in humpback whales. And how is that going to save the planet? And the reality is, well, directly, it's not. But what it does, when you can tell stories about marine mammals, baleen whales, humpback whales, cooperative bubble net foragers, or you can tell stories about great white sharks that you tagged in one place and they swam the entire ocean and wind up over here and they turn out to be a lot older than we thought and smarter than we thought. Or you can talk about all these things. That's what opens people's minds to how important the oceans are or animals are.
Where can we find more about the Alaska Whale Foundation?
The best place to go to find out more about the organization is our website, which is www.alaskawhalefoundation.org. We have information on all the programs we're doing and on the development of our new field station, which we just started in 2015. This will be our first full season, 2016. So that's a good place to start. There's contacts there on how to reach me and how to get in touch with the organization. And more importantly, how to volunteer if you're interested in getting involved, whoever you are, whether you're an undergraduate student. We were talking about photo identification earlier. We have a program where individuals, whoever you are, whether you're 10 years old, whether you're 90 years old, if you want to participate, you can. You can go to our website and you can participate directly by matching photos that we've taken of whales or that people have taken to the existing catalog, so we can actually further that photo identification study. So again, go to the website there, and that's where you can find information on that as well.
Hi, I'm Christine, a volunteer with the Alaska Whale Foundation. Meet the Ocean would like to thank Dr. Andy Szabo and Michelle Frenay for sharing their work with the Alaska Whale Foundation, with special thanks to Charlotte Fisher for her contribution. This episode was edited by Andrew Gettings, with sound design by Kelsey Anderson, original music by Vin Gast, and produced by Katie Steinberg and Paul North. You can find other episodes, videos, and ways to donate at meettheocean.org.